I'm here with Hastings District Councillor Wendy Schollum. Kia ora, Wendy, and thanks for joining me.
Kia ora, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Wendy, it's quite a busy time to be a councillor, and you've just recently been through the long-term plan and unfortunately had to give a fairly significant rates increase. Tell us about that process.
Yeah, and taking a minute to, I think, just reflect on the process as a whole. It was definitely challenging. I've been on council for coming up 6 years now, and observing the depth at which we went into this particular long-term plan was really heartening. So what we did with this long-term plan was we pulled together a long-term plan working group, and all councillors were invited to be on that working group if they wanted to be. And so there were a group of us that put our hands up, and were aptly chaired by Councillor Michael Fowler, who's our performance and monitoring chair. And so before we even came out to the community, we spent a huge amount of time working with staff to identify actually, what are the costs that we've got ahead of us to rebuild, to make sure that our community is resilient, and then what could we do to reduce the burden on the ratepayer. And so before we even came out to the community, we worked really hard to identify over $50 million worth of cuts and deferrals. And so some of those deferrals included things like our very much needed, but in the context in which we're operating in, somewhat less of a priority library rebuild. It included things like new cycleways and non-essential park enhancements and the like. And then we also had to look really critically at cuts that we could make too. So that was looking at some service level reductions. It was looking at things like the Frimley Pool proposed closure, which we took out. And obviously you've reported on the outcome of that more recently once we got more information. And it was also looking at things like non-essential events and whatnot too. So it was a really robust process before we even went to the community. And then hearing back from the community was very sobering. It's challenging times for everyone out there. The same interest rates and insurance costs and cost of living that are driving up costs for councils are obviously hitting just as hard in homes, and we're all feeling it. So the community really said to us, we want to rebuild, but this is too painful right now. So we need a way of doing this that costs us less right now. And so that's why we adopted ultimately the 19% in year one rather than the proposed 25%.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that 19% that and it was brought down after public hearings from 25%. Now, that's from borrowing, though, so that's not really any savings. Is that a long-term? Is that long-term sustainable to keep borrowing? Because I mean, already up to 400 million, and by 2030, I think it's set to be around 700 million. How do you see a way out of that sort of trap of borrowing to keep rates down?
Oh, of course not. And in fact, our first proposal was very much not to take that tact. We made it clear to our community when we consulted that the idea was to make sure council had a balanced budget as soon as possible. By adopting a 19% rate increase in year one, we are essentially borrowing in part for operations. We've been very transparent about that right from the start. But you're right, that's not sustainable. And no one, not a single person on council, is expecting us to do that in the long term. This is to get us through a really unique and critical time. And I think it's really important that we keep in perspective the fact that our long-term plan is comprised of $2 billion worth of capital works. We've got over $1 billion worth of cyclone recovery ahead of us, with our local share being 230 million, and another $1 billion worth of capital works on top of that, which is for roading, things like critical roading maintenance and water infrastructure, and all those things that are absolutely at the core of what councils should provide. But when you look at it, if you take out our cyclone, which, let's be fair, was the most major non-earthquake related natural disaster we've ever had in New Zealand, and costly, the most costly. Looking across the country, it's multiple billions of dollars worth of recovery involved in that one event. You remove that and the 8% targeted rate that's aligned with that, then our rate increase in year one was really 11%. And that's still high, don't get me wrong. There's no way that I'm saying that it's not. But what I'm saying is when you then compare us to the rest of the country, we're actually doing very well in this environment of high inflationary costs, higher cost of services, higher insurance costs. So I'm really proud actually of what our council has done, but we have to keep pushing for more savings. And those savings, the ones that are most meaningful, are not necessarily just the efficiencies we'll be looking for across council. We're already doing that. We've tasked our chief executive with finding another $2.7 million in operational savings this year. And we're also coming together under the Performance and Monitoring Committee to continue looking for further efficiencies. But they're not the areas that make the biggest difference. The areas that make the biggest difference is where we can get better funding mechanisms from NZTA through central government, because $800 million of our debt, our recovery costs is going to be roading and bridges. And those are things that connect our communities, connect our people, connect us to other regions. And that's where we really want to see our government coming to the table a little more. Our ratepayers locally can't bear the full burden of this cost. And the projected LTP debt that we're looking at assumes that we won't be able to get that. That's the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Of course, we're going to be able to do better. The other mechanisms we've got that we can look at is reprioritising our capital spend. So if we really can't get the money that we're hoping and we think we can get from central government, that's where we start having conversations with our community about what gets rebuilt and when. And so it's absolutely about making sure our communities are connected and safe and resilient, but the timing might have to change in order to make sure that our community are not being overly burdened with debt and therefore the interest associated with that, which then drives up rates. That's where we make meaningful difference. There's lots of things on the periphery like shared services and looking at staff levels and all of that sort of stuff. Absolutely, those efficiencies have to happen. But compared to our capital works program, it's small.
Yeah, and we'll get to shared services and that. But you've been through the figures with a fine-tooth comb and been presented by council officials on things. Apart from what you've just said, what other savings do you think there are there? You mentioned staff costs and things like that. Are there some nice to haves that we currently have that actually we don't really need?
Oh, I think we're going to be constantly challenging those things. And the problem we had with our long-term plan process was it was right on the back of the cyclone, really. So, we didn't have a chance to deep dive into the absolute minutiae of everything for that process. And that's the commitment we made with the community going forward. And it's definitely something that Mayor Sandra and the whole council's in behind doing. So, performance and monitoring is going to be doing a huge amount of work in terms of ongoing financial management and challenging our staff. In terms of obvious ones, the reality is if it was obvious, we would have done it already. So now it's about looking for all those little wins. But as I said, actually the big difference comes in at looking at how do we get outside support from central government and how do we program our capital works to make sure that we're not driving up costs for our ratepayers.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned being on the Performance and Monitoring Committee, and you had a meeting last week where you were presented with a report by council officials, and it showed that you were, for the year in June, 14 million over budget on operating costs. Was that quite a shock to you to see that sort of figure?
It wasn't, because it's been signalled right since day dot. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that annual plan that budget's come out of, that overspend's come out of, was about to be consulted on as the cyclone hit. And then we obviously took a break once the cyclone had hit and pushed that out as far as we could in order to get a glimpse of what the costs were going to cost us, knowing full well that we wouldn't have a full understanding at that critical point, because we've got legislative requirements in terms of consulting on an annual plan. So it's not like we couldn't do it. So instead, what we had to do, and every single councillor went into it knowing it, and we communicated to our community, we were having to consult on an annual plan that we didn't have a full grasp on the recovery costs of. And so what our council did was it went in and it went, okay, we're rolling over budgets from previous years here, knowing that we're not actually going to be able to necessarily hold to those because there's unforeseen costs that we know are going to hit us. And then what we also had to do was we actually had to get on with recovery too, Andrew. There was no good us as a council sitting on our hands going, oh, sorry, not in the budget. We're not going to rebuild your critical road. We're not going to stand up our voluntary buyout office. We're not going to help people recover. We actually had to get on with the doing. And so absolutely, that was a number that we saw coming as a council, and we factored it into our long-term plan. So there's not a sudden shock extra amount we have to borrow. That's accounted for within the debt profile that we've put out and consulted on with our community.
But it still is a shock to people out there. 14 million is a lot of money. At that meeting, the Deputy Mayor, Tanya Kerr, said that it needs to be put into perspective, and it's only, I think, 4.5% of overall business. But for the ratepayer who's struggling to survive, 14 million is a figure they can't even consider.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other thing that's really hard for anyone to consider as well is that we're a $3 billion asset owning business entity, the council. So these are huge figures. And I remember when I first joined council and was starting to work in the multi-millions, it was quite jarring too. I'd come from a business background. We didn't work with those numbers. And it's not, I'm not downplaying it. 14 million is a huge number. But we've also got to make sure it's in the context of the fact that a big portion of that is us getting on with recovery. We're still waiting on central government to pay us the funding towards things that they have said they will do. And that's another area of savings for us going forward. And we're having really robust discussions about, because right now with some of the recovery work we're doing, we know central government is going to co-fund us in some of that, but they're not paying us until after the fact. And so that means payer is carrying the holding costs and the interest costs of that borrowing to do that work. So that's definitely another area of savings, which we are very actively pursuing.
But some of it is like Toy Toy, for example, the event centre, didn't make money. It actually made a loss of nearly $1 million. How can you get to a point where those sort of facilities are actually pulling their own weight?
Absolutely. And I mean, that's a conversation that we're having in council already, and we have actually been having for several years. And the reason why I say several years is because poor Toy Toy as a facility, it reopened and we had COVID-19. And then we recovered from COVID-19 and then we had a cyclone. So getting a grasp on an entity like that in those environments where you have no normal is really tricky. And I do want to take a minute to acknowledge that the Toy Toy team also far exceeded predicted revenue, although I absolutely hear you when we say it also exceeded expenditure. However, I also already know, because I stay quite connected with that particular facility because it's one of interest to me, that they have already found other efficiencies. Cleaning was a big area where costs were really high. They found ways of improving that, which will be reported back to us at a future performance and monitoring committee meeting. And also, we've got to have a conversation with our community about whether or not, what percentage of that facility do they want to be a community facility versus a commercial facility? Because that's actually the big conversation. Toy Toy will wash its face if we allow it to be a commercial facility. But what we've heard from our community in the past is they want a certain percentage of it, a reduction in cost for community events and whatnot. So if the appetite has changed and our community wants us 100% focused now on that being a commercial facility, then that's how we will get to a place where it truly makes money. So these are all conversations we need to have with our community, and they need to tell us what they want. Because talk to one person in the street and they'll say, absolutely, I want it 100% commercial and I want it making all the money it needs to operate. And then you'll talk to another person in the street that says, well, actually, it's really critical that, the school choir is able to go there and utilise it and have inter-school activities. And that's really good for our community. So that's democracy. That's the conversation we've got to have.